It is before sunrise on a Friday in Jerusalem. The city is already awake. It is Passover week, and 250,000 pilgrims have packed themselves into every courtyard, every rooftop, every alley between the Temple Mount and the lower city. The smell of roasting lamb is in the air. The sound of prayers has been rising since the fourth watch of the night. But in a stone cell beneath the Praetorium, the palace of the Roman prefect, a man sits in the dark and waits to die. His name is Barabbas. He is not waiting in the way a sick man waits, gradually, with uncertainty. He is waiting the way a condemned man waits. He knows what is coming. He has seen Roman crucifixion before. He has seen what it does to a body. He knows that before this day is over, soldiers will come through that door and walk him to a hill outside the city walls, and that will be the end of Barabbas. He does not know that something is about to happen that has never happened before in the history of the world. There is a name written above his cell, 3 Aramaic letters, a name his mother gave him, a name that meant something to his family, a name that, when you understand what it truly means, will reframe everything that happens on this Friday morning. We will come back to that name, but not yet. Because first, you need to understand who this man was, not the cartoon villain, not the nameless prop in a passion play, the real man, the historical Barabbas. A man specific enough that all 4 gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, felt compelled to record his name. 4 independent accounts, 4 writers who often disagreed on sequence and detail. All 4 agreed his name was Barabbas, and Pilate released him. That kind of agreement across 4 sources is not an accident. These writers wanted you to know this man existed. So who was he? This is not a story about Roman politics. This is not a story about the psychology of crowds. This is not a story about the mechanics of Passover law. This is a story about the most staggering swap in human history, and about a question that has haunted 2,000 years of Christian thought. Did the man who walked free that morning ever understand what had just happened to him? A man sits in the dark. He expects to die. He is about to walk out into the morning sun, and an innocent man is going to take his place. To understand Barabbas, you have to understand the world he was born into. First-century Judea was not a peaceful province, it was a pressure cooker. Rome controlled the land, the taxes, the courts, and the calendar. Roman soldiers stood at the gates of Jerusalem. Roman coins, stamped with the face of Tiberius Caesar and the words "Son of the Divine Augustus," were the currency you used to buy bread. For a devout Jewish man who believed that the land of Israel belonged to God alone, every single day was an act of humiliation. And some men could not take it anymore. They called themselves the Zealots, or sometimes the Sicarii, from the Latin word for a curved dagger, the sica, which they hid beneath their cloaks and used to assassinate Roman collaborators in public spaces. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian who documented this era in extraordinary detail, describes these men not as noble freedom fighters, but as violent insurrectionists who believed God would honor their willingness to spill blood for the land. They struck in marketplaces. They struck during festivals when Jerusalem was crowded and chaos was easy to manufacture. They struck and disappeared into the pilgrimage crowds. Mark tells us exactly what Barabbas was. In chapter 15, verse 7, he writes that Barabbas was imprisoned with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. Not suspected of murder, not accused, committed.
The Greek word Mark uses for what Barabbas was is lestis. Your English Bible might translate it as robber or bandit, but that translation is too soft. Josephus uses the same word, lestis, to describe the zealot rebels who carried out coordinated political violence against Roman rule. This was not a man who stole sandals from a market stall. This was a man who picked up a weapon and used it against a human being. Luke is even more specific. Chapter 23, verse 19. Barabbas had been thrown into prison for an insurrection in the city and for murder. An insurrection in the city, in Jerusalem, during a time when Roman soldiers were stationed on the walls of the Temple Mount itself, watching the crowds below, fingers near their swords, waiting for exactly this kind of trouble. Here's what most people miss. Barabbas was not some random criminal Pilate happened to have on hand. He was the most dangerous kind of prisoner Rome held in Judea, a man who had led organized violence against the empire in the Holy City during the most politically volatile week of the Jewish calendar. Pilate would have known exactly who Barabbas was. Every Roman administrator in Jerusalem would have known his name. Which means when Pilate offers the crowd a choice between Barabbas and Jesus, he is not offering them a choice between a dangerous man and a harmless one. He is, in his own political calculus, offering them what he believes is an obvious choice. Release the teacher from Galilee who has broken no Roman law. Keep the insurrectionist who has. Pilate thinks the crowd will choose Jesus. He is certain of it. He is wrong. But before we get to that courtyard, you need to feel the weight of what Barabbas has done, because the story only works, the swap only lands, if you understand that this was not a good man in a bad situation. This was a man with blood on his hands, real blood. A real person died because of what Barabbas did in that uprising. Someone's father, someone's son, a person with a name we will never know, killed in a street in Jerusalem because Barabbas believed the end justified the means. He sat in that cell with the full weight of that. Or maybe he didn't. Maybe that's the most chilling possibility of all, that Barabbas was so convinced of his cause, so certain that God was on the side of the revolution, that he felt no guilt at all. Josephus tells us the zealots believed their violence was sacred, that God would vindicate them, that dying for the land was dying for God. If that is who Barabbas was, then he sat in that cell not guilty and broken, but defiant and ready. Either way, the door is about to open, and his life is about to change in a way he could never have predicted.
The sun comes up over the Mount of Olives, and Pontius Pilate is already having a bad morning. He did not want to be in Jerusalem this week. Pilate's official residence was in Caesarea Maritima, a Roman city on the Mediterranean coast, marble colonnades, sea breeze, the kind of place a Roman prefect could feel like a Roman prefect. Jerusalem was different. Jerusalem during Passover was a city wound tight as a bowstring. 250,000 pilgrims, nationalist sentiment running hot, the memory of past uprisings still fresh in everyone's minds. Pilate brought extra troops every year for this week. He came personally to manage the situation. He did not come to conduct a theological trial. And yet here he is, before the 6th hour, standing in the Praetorium with a prisoner in front of him and a crowd gathering outside, and the chief priests are pressing him to act, and his own wife has just sent a servant through the door with a message so urgent she could not wait. Matthew records it in chapter 27, verse 19. While Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him a message, "Do not have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him." Stop and feel how strange that is.
The only woman to speak in the entire Passion narrative is not a disciple. She is not a follower of Jesus. She is a Roman woman, Claudia Procula, tradition gives her name, the wife of the man about to sign the death warrant. And she has been awake since before dawn, shaken by something she saw in her sleep, so disturbed that she interrupts a public trial to warn her husband. Pilate reads the message. He looks at the man standing before him. He has already questioned Jesus and found nothing. No evidence of insurrection, no call to arms, no threat to Rome. Luke tells us Pilate says it plainly, "I find no basis for a charge against this man." And then Pilate remembers the custom. Every Passover, the Roman prefect would release one prisoner to the Jewish crowd, a gesture of goodwill during the festival, a small act of political generosity designed to reduce tension in a city that was always one bad decision away from a riot. It was not a formal Roman legal institution. It was a pragmatic tool, a pressure valve. Pilate has done it before. He decides to use it now. He goes out to the crowd and offers them a choice. Matthew chapter 27, verse 17. And pay attention to how Pilate phrases it, because the phrasing matters. Which one do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Messiah? Pilate calls him the Messiah, a Roman prefect, in public, using the full Jewish title. This is either sarcasm or political theater, but either way, Pilate is telling the crowd exactly what he thinks. He thinks Jesus is harmless. He thinks Barabbas is dangerous. He thinks the choice is obvious. But it gets stranger. Mark tells us in chapter 15, verse 11, that the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. The crowd that is shouting does not arrive shouting. They are organized. The chief priests, Caiaphas and his circle, have worked the crowd before Pilate steps outside. They know what they want. They know that a live Jesus is a problem. A dead Jesus, they believe, is the end of the movement. So the crowd shouts for Barabbas. Pilate pushes back. Luke records that he appeals to them a second time, trying to release Jesus. The crowd shouts louder. Pilate tries a third time. 3 attempts, 3 failures. The man who holds the legal authority to set Jesus free tries 3 times to use it, and 3 times the crowd refuses him. There is a particular word the Greek New Testament uses for what Pilate does when he releases Barabbas. The word is aphiemi. It means to release, to let go, to set free. But aphiemi is also the word used in the Lord's Prayer, "Forgive us our debts," from the same root. The word for forgiving a guilty prisoner and the word for forgiving a debt is the same word. Pilate did not know he was doing theology. He thought he was doing crowd control. But the word he used that morning has echoed for 2,000 years. He calls for water. He washes his hands in front of the crowd and says, "I am innocent of this man's blood." And then he does it. He releases Barabbas. He hands Jesus over to be flogged and crucified. Somewhere in that stone cell below the Praetorium, a door opens. A soldier steps in, and instead of the words Barabbas expected, instead of "it is time," the soldier says something entirely else. "You are free to go."
If this is your first time watching this channel, right now would be a good moment to subscribe. We cover stories like this one, the people behind the well-known verses, the history underneath the familiar narrative, and there is a lot more coming. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it. And if this video is hitting something for you, drop a comment below. I read every one. Now, back to Barabbas, because we have not yet talked about his name, Barabbas. 2 Aramaic words pressed together into one name. Bar means son. You see it everywhere in the New Testament. Simon Bar-Jonah, son of Jonah. James and John, sons of Zebedee. Bar is simply the Aramaic word for son, straightforward, common. But the second word is not common at all. Abba. If you grew up in a Christian tradition, you have heard this word in a specific context. Paul uses it in Romans chapter 8, verse 15. You received the Spirit of adoption, by whom we cry out, Abba, Father. Jesus uses it in Gethsemane, the night before his death, pressing his forehead to the cold ground in a garden and saying, Abba, Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Abba is not the formal Hebrew word for God. It is the intimate word, the family word, the word a small child uses. It is closer to Papa than to Father. It is the word that assumes closeness, assumes relationship, assumes you are allowed to walk straight into the presence of the one you are addressing, without an appointment, without a priest, without a sacrifice. Abba is what you call someone who will pick up when you call. And the name of the man sitting in that cell, the murderer, the insurrectionist, the man with blood on his hands, is Son of the Father, Abba, Barabbas. And this is where it gets remarkable. Because on that Friday morning, Pontius Pilate stands before a crowd and offers them a choice between two men. One is named Son of the Father. One is the Son of the Father. Not by name, but by nature, by eternal reality, by the claim he has been waking in synagogues and hillsides and temple courts for 3 years. The crowd has to choose which Son of the Father lives and which one dies. They choose the name. They let the reality go. Now, some scholars will tell you this is coincidence, that Barabbas was a common enough surname in first-century Judea, that reading theological meaning into it is eisegesis, reading into the text what you want to find. And they are not wrong to raise that caution. You should always be careful of overreading symbolic patterns into historical narrative. But here is what is not coincidence. Here is what is not interpretation. Here is simply the text sitting there in plain sight for 2,000 years. The man who walked out of that prison was guilty. The man who walked into the execution was innocent. That is not symbolism. That is the historical record confirmed across 4 independent gospel accounts, referenced by Roman historians, embedded in the legal proceedings of a Roman prefect who tried 3 times to prevent it. Whatever you do with the name, the swap itself is real. Pay attention to this. Josephus, writing in his Jewish War, documents insurrection after insurrection in Jerusalem in the decades surrounding the 1st century. He describes the violence of men exactly like Barabbas, men who believed so deeply in the coming kingdom of God that they were willing to kill for it, to die for it, to drag their entire nation into war for it. Most of them died, many of them were crucified. Rome did not tolerate revolutionaries, and Rome had very efficient ways of ending them. Barabbas had every reason to believe he was going to end the same way, and then the crowd shouted his name instead of the other man's name. This is not a story about a lucky criminal. This is not a story about a crowd making a bad decision. This is not a story about Pilate losing his nerve. This is a story about a transaction that was arranged before the foundation of the world, playing out in real time in a Roman courtyard on a Friday morning in Jerusalem, with a murderer as its unlikely centerpiece. The chief priests thought they were eliminating a problem. Pilate thought he was managing a crowd. The crowd thought they were choosing a hero. None of them understood what they were doing. Paul would write about it later in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 8. None of the rulers of this age understood it, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. They did not understand it. But Barabbas was about to walk out of a prison cell and feel it, in his chest, in his legs, in the first breath of free air, before he understood a single word of the theology. And that changes everything about how you read what happens next.
He walks out. That is all the Bible tells us. Barabbas walks out, and then he disappears. No follow-up, no epilogue, no, and Barabbas went on to do this. Matthew records his release in one sentence, Mark in one sentence, Luke in one sentence, John in one sentence, and then nothing. The man who was at the center of the most consequential legal decision in human history simply vanishes from the text, which means we do not know what happened to him. We do not know if he stood at the edge of the crowd and watched what they did to Jesus. We do not know if he went home and told his family what had happened. We do not know if he ever learned the name of the man who took his place on that cross, the man who, in the most literal sense possible, died the death that had been assigned to Barabbas. What we do know is this. Somewhere outside the walls of Jerusalem, on a hill called Golgotha, the place of the skull, Roman soldiers drove iron spikes into the wrists of a man who had done nothing wrong. And above his head, Pilate ordered a sign to be nailed to the cross. John tells us what it said in 3 languages, Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, so that every pilgrim in Jerusalem that Passover could read it. It said, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." The chief priests protested. They told Pilate to change it, to write, "This man claimed to be King of the Jews." Pilate, who had spent all morning being pushed around, finally found something he would not budge on. He said, "What I have written, I have written." On a cross that was built for Barabbas, they nailed a sign that named someone else. Here's the part nobody tells you. Roman crucifixion was not a private execution. It was a public spectacle, conducted on roadsides and hillsides, specifically so that travelers and pilgrims would see it, would look at the dying man, would understand what Rome did to people who caused problems. Golgotha was outside the city walls, near a road. People passed by. People watched. Which means if Barabbas stayed anywhere near Jerusalem that Friday, he could have seen it. He could have stood in that crowd and watched the man who took his place struggling to breathe on a cross that had his name on it, a cross that the Roman execution order, somewhere in Pilate's records, still listed under the crime of Barabbas, an insurrection he led, a murder he committed. Think about what that does to a person. Not the theology, not yet, just the human reality of it. You walk out of a prison cell expecting to die. You blink in the morning sun, and then you hear the crowd, and you follow the sound, and you see on a hill outside the city a man dying in your place, a man you have never met, a man who, by every measure of Roman justice, should be walking free while you hang there. Every person who has ever walked out of a situation they should never have survived understands something of this moment. The soldier who came home when his friends did not, the patient who received the last available treatment, the driver who walked away from a wreck that killed everyone else. There is a specific kind of weight that comes with unearned survival, a specific kind of question that follows you home. Why me? Why not me? What do I do with this? Barabbas had that question in its most extreme form, because the man on that cross did not die instead of Barabbas by accident. He did not die instead of Barabbas because of a bureaucratic error, or a crowd's impulse, or Pilate's political weakness. Jesus of Nazareth, the one his own followers called the Son of God, the one Pilate's wife dreamed about before sunrise, the one the sign above the cross called King, walked into that courtroom knowing exactly what was going to happen. John chapter 10, verse 18, Jesus says it himself, before the arrest, before the trial, "No one takes my life from me. I lay it down of my own accord." He chose the cross. And here is where the name of Barabbas becomes something more than historical irony. It becomes a window into the entire architecture of what Christians call the gospel. The Son of the Father, the eternal, innocent, divine Son, died in the place of a son of a human father who was guilty. Barabbas was not a symbol chosen for dramatic effect. He was the first specific human being for whom this transaction was visibly, publicly, literally enacted. Before there was a doctrine of substitutionary atonement argued in seminaries and written in theology books, there was a man named Barabbas walking out of a prison in Jerusalem, while an innocent man walked in. The doctrine came later. The event came first, and the event was not tidy or comfortable or abstract. It was iron and wood and a crowd and a man blinking in the morning sun, trying to understand why he was still alive. Paul writes in Romans chapter 5, verse 8, "God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." Not after we cleaned ourselves up, not after we showed remorse, not after we promised to do better, while we were still sinners. Barabbas had not repented. Barabbas had not changed. Barabbas walked out of that cell the same man who walked in, a murderer, an insurrectionist, a man the Roman state had rightfully condemned, and the swap happened anyway. Not because Barabbas deserved it, not because he earned it, not because he was secretly a good person underneath it all, because the other man chose it. If you are watching this and you have spent years feeling like your past disqualifies you, like what you have done is too specific, too real, too documented to be covered by something as simple as grace, then I want you to sit with Barabbas for a moment, not as a metaphor, as a man, a real man with a real criminal record and real blood on his hands, standing in real morning sunlight, free. That is where the gospel begins, not with good people getting rewarded, with guilty people walking out of cells they should never have left. We do not know what Barabbas did with the rest of his life. The text gives us nothing. Early church tradition is silent. Josephus doesn't mention him again. He is simply, after that Friday morning, gone. And that silence is not an accident, because the story of what Barabbas did after the cross, whether he understood, whether he came back, whether he wept or celebrated, or spent the rest of his life trying to forget, that story is not recorded in Scripture. It is recorded in you.
If this video is doing something in you right now, if something is landing differently than you expected, would you do something for me? Share this video with one person, just one, someone who needs to hear that the gospel starts with a guilty man walking free. That is all, one person. And stay with me for the last 2 minutes, because I have 3 things I want to leave you with, and the third one is the one that has stayed with me longest. 3 things. That is what I want to leave you with. 3 things about Barabbas that I think are worth carrying out of this video and into the rest of your week. The first is this. Barabbas was not a symbol. He was a man. This matters more than it sounds. There is a tendency, and I have done it myself, to read the Passion narrative like a morality play. Pilate is the symbol of political cowardice. The crowd is the symbol of mob mentality. Barabbas is the symbol of guilty humanity getting a second chance. And while those readings are not wrong, they can become a way of keeping the story at arm's length. Symbols do not bleed. Symbols do not sit in dark cells waiting for soldiers to come through the door. Symbols do not blink in morning sunlight trying to understand why they are still alive.
Barabbas bled. He sat in that cell. He blinked in that sunlight. And on a cross outside the city walls, a man with nail wounds in his wrists struggled to breathe on wood that had Barabbas's name on it. Real wood, real nails, real name. That is the first thing. The second thing is harder. If you are a follower of Jesus, if you have said yes to the gospel in any form, at any point in your life, then you are not an observer of the Barabbas story. You are Barabbas. Not as a metaphor, structurally, theologically, the entire architecture of what Paul calls justification, being declared righteous before God, is built on exactly the same transaction that happened in Pilate's courtyard. A guilty person goes free because an innocent person takes their place. That is not one illustration of the gospel. That is the gospel, enacted in front of 250,000 people on the most watched morning of the Jewish calendar so that nobody could miss it. You were in that cell, maybe not for murder, maybe not for insurrection, but the verdict was the same, guilty, and the swap happened anyway. Not because you deserved it, not because you were better than Barabbas, because the other man chose it. That is the second thing. And the third thing, the one I said would stay with you longest, is a question. We know Barabbas walked out. We do not know if he ever looked back. Scripture gives us to him fully on the way out the door, his name, his crimes, his release, and then closes the book on him. We do not know if he stood at the foot of that cross and wept. We do not know if he spent the next 40 years telling anyone who would listen what had happened to him on that Friday morning. We do not know if he went back to the zealots, picked up his sword again, and died in some later uprising, having never once connected the dots between what he was and what he had been given. We do not know. And that open ending is not a flaw in the narrative, it is an invitation. Because the story of what a person does after they walk out of the cell they should never have left, after they receive the mercy they didn't earn, after the door swings open and the morning air hits their face, that story Scripture leaves blank on purpose, because that story belongs to the person reading it. It belongs to you. Which one do you want to be? The Barabbas who walked into the rest of his life and never looked back, never asked why, never let the weight of what happened to him become something that changed how he lived? Or the one who turned around, who stood at the foot of that hill, who let himself feel what it cost? That is the question Barabbas leaves on the table. Which of the two do you want to be? Tell me in the comments, when you picture Barabbas walking out of that prison into the morning sun, what do you think he felt? I genuinely want to know, because I think how you answer that question says something about where you are with the story yourself. And if this video found you at a moment when you needed it, when you needed to be reminded that the gospel begins not with good people being rewarded, but with guilty people walking free, share it. Put it in front of someone who needs to hear that their past does not qualify them, that the swap is real, that the door can open. 2,000 years ago, on a Friday morning in Jerusalem, a door opened for a man named Barabbas, son of the Father, freed by the Son of the Father. He walked out into the light. What he did next, nobody recorded. What you do next, that part is still being written.